Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time, a gentle exploration of a life that would, in its own way, reshape the world. As the day softly recedes, and the quiet of the evening deepens around you, I invite you to settle into a space of comfort, to let your mind unwind, and to allow these words to carry you, like a tranquil current, into a state of peaceful relaxation. Tonight we will trace the path of a man whose name echoes through the pages of history, not with a clamor or a rush, but with the steady, inexorable rhythm of unfolding events. We speak of Vladimir Lenin, a figure whose early years began in a quiet corner of Russia, far from the bustling centers of power, amidst a family whose story itself tells of resilience and intellectual striving. Imagine, if you will, the vast landscapes of Russia stretching out in every direction under an endless sky. Far to the east of Moscow, some 700 kilometers away, lies the city of Simbirsk, a place where, on the 22nd of April in the year 1870, a boy named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov first drew breath. The calendar then, the old-style Julian, might have marked it as the 10th of April, a small detail that simply adds to the sense of time flowing gently, marking moments in different ways. His father, Ilia Nikolaevich Ulyanov, carried a story of quiet determination, born into a serf family in 1831. Think of the conditions of serfdom, a life tied to the land, to another's will, a life often without the freedom to choose one's own path. Yet, Ilia, with an innate spirit that refused to be bound, managed to earn his freedom in his youth, a testament to his quiet strength and perseverance. He then pursued knowledge, studying physics and mathematics at Kazan University, a place of learning that would much later play its own small part in his son's journey. Following his studies, Ilia embarked upon a successful career as an educator, overseeing public schools across Russia. His dedication to public education, a quiet commitment to enlightenment, saw him rise through the ranks, eventually becoming a state councillor. This position, by the early 1880s, quietly elevated the Ulyanov family into the minor Russian nobility, a gentle acknowledgement of Ilia's significant contributions to the betterment of society through education. Vladimir's mother, Maria Alexandrovna Blank, brought a rich tapestry of heritage to the family, with roots tracing back to German, Swedish, Russian, and Jewish ancestors. It is a detail of history that suggests a quiet confluence of cultures within their home. Yet it appears that Vladimir himself may never have been aware of his mother's Jewish heritage, a thread woven into the fabric of his family's past that remained, perhaps, unspoken or simply unknown to him. Maria and Ilia shared a life that brought 8 children into the world, though 2 of them, sadly, passed away in infancy, a common, heartbreaking reality of those times. Vladimir was the 3rd eldest, arriving after his sister Anna in 1864 and his brother Alexander in 1866. His childhood, in many ways, mirrored the rising success of his father's career, unfolding in a comfortable, well-appointed home in Simbirsk. Imagine the quiet corners of such a home, filled with books, perhaps the soft glow of lamplight on winter evenings, the sounds of a family moving gently through their days. Beyond the city, the Ulyanovs would often retreat to a manor in Kokoshkino, a peaceful countryside escape. Picture the rolling hills, the rustling leaves, the serene beauty of the Russian landscape, offering moments of quiet respite and reflection. Young Vladimir, during these years, seemed to embody his father's intellectual spark. By his teenage years, he displayed a considerable intellect, excelling in his studies, his mind keen and focused. He also became an accomplished chess player, a game that demands calm concentration, strategic foresight, and a quiet patience, qualities that perhaps hinted at the path his life would eventually take. Yet, this upper-middle-class idyll, this peaceful period of youth, was not destined to last. Life, with its unpredictable currents, can often shatter even the most tranquil of scenes. When Vladimir was just 15 years of age, a profound shift occurred. His father, Ilia, died prematurely of a brain hemorrhage in January 1886. This event cast a long shadow, deeply impacting Vladimir, who in the aftermath began to exhibit an increasingly reactionary and rebellious spirit. The quiet boy, the diligent student, began to subtly transform, a turning point in his young life. The following year, the situation was compounded by an even more devastating event. His older brother, Alexander, who had left home sometime earlier to attend St. Petersburg State University, found himself implicated in a conspiracy. The target of this plot was none other than the ruler of the Russian Empire, Alexander III. A shadow fell over the family as Alexander, along with several others, was executed shortly afterwards for his role in the conspiracy. This tragedy, this profound loss and shock, was a pivotal moment. Vladimir would indeed never be the same again. His gradual descent into the world of extremist politics, a path that would lead him far from his childhood home, can be traced, with quiet certainty, back to this heartbreaking event. To truly understand Vladimir's subsequent actions, and those of his brother Alexander in that fateful year of 1887, it is helpful to gently place them within the broader context of Russia's political landscape during the second half of the 19th century. For many centuries, Russia had largely existed outside the mainstream currents of European politics and culture, a vast and often isolated realm. However, with the reign of Peter I in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a determined effort began to modernize and reform the country. The aim was to bring Russia more in line with other European states, such as the sophisticated salons of France or the structured empire of Austria. This work, this slow and steady push towards transformation, was continued by his near successor, Catherine the Great, a German princess herself, who harbored a quiet ambition to forge Russia into a modern nation. All of this unfolded as the Russian Empire itself was expanding dramatically, its borders stretching ever wider. By the close of the 18th century, Russian explorers and colonists had ventured as far as the Bering Straits and into Manchuria, extending the Russian state to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. To the west, Catherine initiated a series of quiet conquests, bringing parts of the Caucasus, Poland, and Ukraine under Russian rule, weaving them into the vast imperial tapestry. Yet, despite these expansive and modernizing efforts, the country remained, in many significant respects, economically and socially backward. Serfdom, an ancient system under which Russian commoners were tied to the land, and the manorial lord, akin to a quasi-slave state, still predominated across the vast country. The economy remained overwhelmingly rural, rooted in the earth, and the Orthodox Church exerted a huge, quiet influence over society, deeply embedded in the daily lives and beliefs of the people. Politically, the country was incredibly authoritarian, ruled by the Tsars and the nobility, primarily in their own self-interest, with little voice given to the common person. In a world where nations like the United States, Britain, and France were emerging in their modern, more liberal forms during the 19th century, the Russian Empire, by comparison, appeared politically and socially entrenched in the past, a land of ancient customs and structures. These underlying issues were further compounded by a series of events in the years preceding Vladimir's birth and throughout his childhood. In 1855, Alexander II ascended to the throne as Tsar of Russia. He was perceived as a liberal reformer, a ruler who quietly harbored the ambition to drag Russia into the modern world. Thus, in 1861, with a stroke of reformist will, he brought serfdom to an end, emancipating the serfs of Russia in one of the most striking social reforms of the 19th century. It was a momentous change, a quiet liberation for millions, He also sought to reform the courts, the policing system, and the education system, laying the groundwork for a more just and equitable society. However, in 1866, he narrowly survived an assassination attempt. This jarring event had a chilling effect, and thereafter his liberal inclinations were toned down, becoming more cautious, more guarded. But the reforms he had initiated had, as the saying goes, let the genie out of the bottle. In Russia, new ideas began to be discussed in a more tolerant, albeit still constrained, environment. Driven by influential writers like Fyodor Dostoevsky, Pyotr Kropotkin, and Mikhail Bulgakov, who quietly questioned the foundations of Russian society, people began to openly discuss radical ideas and political theories, such as anarchism, nihilism, and communism. Many Russians, stirred by this intellectual awakening, yearned for further, deeper reforms of society. Notably, there was a growing desire for the creation of a parliament, a Duma, and an end to the autocratic state ruled solely by the Tsars. Groups such as the Narodniks and the People's Will emerged, operating as political organizations, agitating, sometimes violently, for these changes. It was this latter group which, in 1881, tragically succeeded in assassinating Alexander II. This act ushered in a period of even greater discontent and repression. He was succeeded by his son Alexander III, who was diametrically opposed to the reforms his father had implemented. Instead, he harbored a firm desire to crack down on liberal dissent across Russia. Thus, the country Vladimir was growing up in during the 1880s was a powder keg, a land silently simmering with political discontent and instability, a stark contrast to the quiet comfort of his early years. It was into this charged political environment that Vladimir arrived in 1887 at Kazan University to commence his studies. Almost immediately, he found himself drawn into a protest against the government's harsh crackdown on student societies, which were perceived as hotbeds of political dissent. His quiet participation in this resulted in a brief arrest and ultimately his expulsion from the university. Yet, this brief spell there had ignited a fire within him, kindling the flames of political radicalization that would continue to burn brightly. In the months that followed, Vladimir, now unmoored from formal education, began reading voraciously, absorbing the ideas of various Russian and European political writers. Among others, he was soon attracted to the profound writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two German political philosophers and social critics. They had been deeply critical of the manner in which industrial society was developing, observing the stark inequalities and the concentration of wealth. In their seminal 1848 pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, they had postulated a revolutionary idea that bourgeois capitalist society should be replaced by one in which the industrial proletariat, the working class, took everything in society into communal ownership. This vision, this idea of a profoundly different social order, held a particular appeal for Vladimir, especially at a time when industrialization was beginning to rapidly advance in Russian cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan and Samara, drawing vast numbers of people into factories and urban centers. However, the writings of Marx and Engels were not the only intellectual influence shaping him at this time. His political views were still very much under formation, evolving and deepening with each book he consumed, each quiet hour spent in contemplation. Yet there is no doubt that his perspectives were already radical, even before he reached his 20th year. By 1890, a quiet door opened for Vladimir thanks to his mother, Maria. Using her family's connections within the Russian education system, she was able to ensure that he could sit exams at the University of St. Petersburg, bypassing the need to complete his studies at Kazan University. He passed these examinations with first-class honors, a testament to his formidable intellect and dedicated self-study. Thereafter, he took up a position as a legal assistant in Samara during the 1890s. Throughout these years, in the quiet routine of his legal work, he continued to foster his political radicalism, engaging with numerous political organizations, often in clandestine ways. Russia's radical political scene was buoyant at this time, stirred by a series of devastating events that deeply affected the common people. In 1891, a dry autumn was followed by a bitterly cold winter, where temperatures plummeted to below -30 degrees Celsius in some parts of the country, particularly along the course of the mighty Volga River. This harsh winter was then succeeded by a particularly dry spring and summer in 1892. All these environmental factors combined to cause widespread harvest failures across much of Russia. Famine, a grim specter, struck thereafter, claiming lives and livelihoods. This crisis was tragically compounded by the incompetent and slow response of the government of Tsar Alexander III and other traditional pillars of Russian society, such as the Orthodox Church, which struggled to adequately address the scale of suffering. By the time the famine finally abated in late 1892, a staggering 350,000 people had died of starvation, and millions more were left malnourished or severely impacted in myriad other ways. As criticism of the government escalated, growing louder with each passing day, radical groups such as the Communists and Nihilists found ever greater numbers of supporters among the disillusioned populace of Russia. The political radicalism within Russian society continued to intensify, and in this environment, Lenin in provincial Samara began to feel a sense of marginalization, a quiet frustration with his distant position. And so it was that in 1893 he decided to leave Samara and set off for the capital, St. Petersburg, a city bustling with political and intellectual ferment. There he continued to work as a legal assistant, maintaining a quiet facade, but his energies were primarily and passionately poured into working to foster the Marxist and communist movement in the city. Socially revolutionary groups such as these were, of course, effectively outlawed by the government of Alexander III, forced to operate in the shadows, their activities clandestine and carefully guarded. However, the Tsar's premature death from kidney failure in 1894 brought his son Nicholas II to the throne. While Nicholas was perceived as more liberal than his father, the overall political environment would, regrettably, remain repressive, a heavy hand still suppressing dissent. No sooner had Vladimir arrived in the capital than he became deeply involved with a revolutionary communist cell in the city. Its members primarily hailed from the Technological Institute of St. Petersburg, a hub of intellectual and scientific thought. They termed themselves Social Democrats, consciously emulating the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which was firmly Marxist and communist in its ideology. By the spring of 1894, Vladimir's quiet yet intense activities had already drawn the attention of the secret police in St. Petersburg. He had come to their attention as a rising Marxist figure, a name to be watched. Nevertheless, his politics only became more radical in the months that followed, his convictions deepening. This radicalization intensified particularly after he met and entered into a relationship with Nadezhda Krupskaya, whom he affectionately referred to as Nadia. She was a school teacher, and by that time herself held radical Marxist political views, creating a shared intellectual and emotional bond. He had also by then become deeply involved in the underground publishing of Marxist pamphlets in the city, the quiet clandestine work of disseminating revolutionary ideas. It was this very activity, this quiet defiance, which eventually led to his arrest and the apprehension of several dozen of his associates by the authorities in 1895. They had been in the midst of preparing to publish a communist newspaper, a beacon of their ideas, to be called Iskra, meaning the spark. Following his arrest, Lenin was refused legal representation, a denial of basic rights, and was detained for over a year before his eventual sentencing. This period of imprisonment, though restrictive, proved to be a profoundly formative time in his life. Confined, but not deterred, he began working on a significant book entitled The Development of Capitalism in Russia, transforming his quiet confinement into a period of intense intellectual production. Eventually, late in 1896, he was sentenced to 3 years in exile in Siberia, that vast, cold, and often inhospitable region of Russia, lying beyond the Ural Mountains. This was not a prison sentence in the conventional sense, but the Russian state viewed exile to Siberia as an effective way of removing a political threat from civilization. So remote and sparsely populated was this immense wilderness. He was joined there by Nadia in 1898, and they were wed within weeks, a quiet ceremony in the vastness of exile. This was partly due to medical complications that Nadia suffered from, though they would, as fate would have it, never have children. Vladimir, ever the intellectual, continued to write throughout this time, channeling his thoughts into published works. He eventually saw The Development of Capitalism in Russia, published under the pseudonym Vladimir Ilyich in 1899. His period of exile eventually ended in the early spring of 1900, marking a return to a more active, though still constrained, life. However, the authorities strictly forbade him from returning to St. Petersburg, and so it was that he briefly settled in Pskov, a city south of the capital. Here, Vladimir quickly became involved in publishing a new revolutionary newspaper, again named Iskra, meaning the spark, symbolizing the light of revolution he hoped to ignite. Yet he quickly realized that if he continued to operate on Russian soil, he would inevitably be rearrested and likely suffer an even greater sentence, a more severe period of confinement. Consequently, in the summer of 1900, he made the quiet yet firm decision to leave Russia once more, heading for Switzerland. There he connected with some revolutionary groups, finding kindred spirits, before relocating to Munich in the German Empire, where he was joined by Nadia in 1901. It was during this period of European exile that he began writing under the name which would become synonymous with his identity, the name by which history would remember him, Lenin. By 1902 he and Nadia had moved again, this time making their way to London, a bustling city that offered a degree of political freedom not found in autocratic Russia. From this distant outpost, Lenin continued to run Iskra, with the newspaper being cleverly smuggled into Russia, a quiet act of intellectual insurgency. It was during this significant time in exile in London that Lenin composed his most famous written work, What Is to Be Done, published in 1902. In this influential text, he articulated a significant departure from many prevailing communist views. He rejected the idea, held by many contemporary communists, that it was an inevitable historical progression for the proletariat, the working class, to gradually move society towards a socialist state, which would then in time naturally evolve into a communist one. Adherents of this more passive view claimed that the role of communist parties was simply to shepherd this process along, to guide it gently. Instead, Lenin believed a far more interventionist line was needed, a more active and decisive approach, to ensure the ultimate victory of communism over capitalism. If needs be, he argued, this could involve overt armed struggle, a quiet but firm call to action. His core belief was that the harsh working conditions of the proletariat, coupled with other societal factors, did indeed create a profound desire for a socialist state amongst the workers in countries like Russia, Germany, and Britain. However, he contended that they would not, by themselves, simply move towards socialism and then communism without a revolutionary movement, a disciplined and dedicated vanguard, to actively guide them there. Once this transformative goal was achieved in one nation, Lenin believed that this new state would then serve to drive the international communist movement, acting as a beacon and a force for change across the globe. As such, Lenin now conceived of the Russian communist movement as what he termed the vanguard of the proletariat, a highly organized and committed movement which would lead the proletariat of Russia, and subsequently Europe, towards communism. This was a powerful, if quiet, shift in communist ideology, but inherent in this view was a potential danger. If the communist parties in Russia were solely responsible for the communist movement, both at home and internationally, then surely all manner of conduct by the Russian communist movement could be justified as necessary for the greater good of international communism, potentially overriding individual rights or democratic processes. While in London, a city of quiet intellectual ferment and political debate, Lenin also became involved in one of the critical episodes in the early history of the Russian communist movement. It was during Lenin's earlier exile in Siberia in 1898. However, the other faction, which Lenin quickly emerged as the quiet yet forceful leader of, argued for a more restricted membership. He believed that membership should be reserved for more committed revolutionaries, a disciplined core dedicated to active revolutionary work. When the crucial vote was held on this matter in November, the party, with a quiet but definitive crack, split into two distinct groups. Lenin's faction, though numerically smaller, became known as the Bolsheviks, a term that ironically means majority. The other faction were thereafter known as the Mensheviks, meaning minority. This apparent contradiction in names arose from the fact that a majority of the editorial board of Iskra, the revolutionary newspaper, had voted in favor of Lenin's faction during the initial dispute, giving his group a temporary, symbolic majority. In that specific context, the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks did not immediately result in the creation of two entirely autonomous political parties. Rather, they initially became two distinct factions operating within the larger RSDLP framework. Nevertheless, the division between them was extremely acrimonious, fueled in no small part by Lenin himself, who in the summer of 1904 published a treatise entitled One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. This work bitterly attacked the Mensheviks, articulating his strong ideological differences and asserting the correctness of his own path. These resolute actions proved successful, and by early 1905, the Bolsheviks were gradually acquiring control of the Central Committee of the RSDLP, solidifying their position within the revolutionary movement. The timing of this internal consolidation was propitious, for important events were quietly unfolding in Russia during the first months of 1905. On the 22nd of January that year, a procession of several thousand unarmed workers marched peacefully on the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Their quiet intention was to present a humble petition, a plea for an improvement of workers' rights in Russian factories, a simple request for better conditions. However, in a tragic and striking overreaction, government forces opened fire on the protesters, killing over 150 people and injuring hundreds more. This horrific event became known as Bloody Sunday, a dark stain on Russian history, and it sent shockwaves across the nation, shattering any remaining illusions of a benevolent Tsar. This tragedy, combined with Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which had exposed the weaknesses of the Tsarist regime, incited a wave of revolution across Russia in 1905. Workers went on strike in many cities, portions of the army mutinied, and agrarian unrest simmered and flared across the vast countryside. The revolution of 1905, this sudden eruption of widespread discontent, served as the spark that led Lenin to return to Russia for the first time in 5 years. He was soon in St. Petersburg, a city alive with revolutionary fervor, where he played a central role in establishing a new communist newspaper, aptly titled Novaya Zizin, meaning new life. Through this publication and his other writings, he advocated in favor of trying to expand the RSDLP membership, sensing an opportune moment amidst the intense revolutionary fervor in Russia. But the moment, as it often does in such turbulent times, was already passing. By October 1905, the Tsar Nicholas II issued what became known as the October Manifesto. In this document, he made wide-ranging concessions to the myriad protesters throughout Russia, a quiet acknowledgement of the deep unrest. These concessions included a declaration that many civil rights, which had been established elsewhere in Europe as far back as the 18th century, would now be granted to Russian citizens, promising a measure of freedom. The manifesto also promised the creation of a new Russian parliament, to be known as the Duma, and that political parties could now be established to elect members to this legislative assembly. This had the immediate effect of significantly de-escalating the political crisis and effectively concluding the revolution of 1905. However, in the years that followed, Nicholas quietly but steadily reneged on most of his promises. While a state Duma was indeed established, Nicholas disbanded the first one, which was elected in 1906, deeming its membership to be too radical, too defiant. Subsequent Dumas were carefully engineered to be more conservative and consequently largely ineffective organs of government, offering little real power. Meanwhile, martial law was swiftly imposed in 1906, and political dissent was brutally crushed across Russia in the years that followed as the political crackdown gathered pace. In 1906 and 1907, as the heavy hand of repression tightened its grip, Lenin and the Bolsheviks quietly considered their options. The revolution of 1905 had clearly been a false dawn, a fleeting moment of hope extinguished. What then, they mused, was the path forward? One faction, led by a rising figure within the Georgian branch of the communist movement, Joseph Stalin, advocated engaging in a terror campaign, a program whereby state institutions would be attacked. This, he argued, would have the added benefit of helping to finance the RSDLP through expropriations. There were few supporters of this more extreme approach, though Lenin was not entirely opposed to it in principle. By early 1906, in the face of the intensifying crackdown, Lenin had quietly slipped over the border into the Grand Duchy of Finland. This territory was a constituent part of the Russian Empire, yet it was ruled somewhat autonomously, offering a small haven of relative freedom. Here the Bolsheviks were able to operate with a degree of liberty for a time in 1906, and could easily get their printed material into St. Petersburg and Moscow from just across the Finnish border. Yet it was soon realized that this limited freedom would not last, and that there would need to be a return to the tactics employed between 1900 and 1905. Once again, the RSDLP leaders would head into exile, further to the west, to countries like Britain, where their activities were more tolerated than in the autocratic East. By 1907, Lenin was back in London, a city that had become a familiar, if temporary, refuge. Here the Bolsheviks successfully resumed control over the RSDLP, subtly outmaneuvering the Menshevik faction at the party's 5th Congress, which took place that summer. The quiet decision was then taken to move the party's headquarters to Paris, a new European base of operations. Lenin and Nadia had relocated there by the end of 1908, continuing their never-ending lives as nomadic revolutionaries, always seeking a place where their ideas could find a voice. But not before Lenin had spent several months undertaking quiet, diligent research in the vast archives of the British Museum in London during the summer of 1908. This intense period of study became the intellectual basis of his book, Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, a work exploring philosophical questions. The subsequent move to Paris, however, also proved transient, another temporary stop in their revolutionary odyssey. Over the next several years, Lenin spent stints, usually consisting of a few months at a time, in other European cities, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Prague and Krakow, These were, in some ways, years of quiet decline for him, as his influence within the RSDLP seemed to wane, a subtle shift in his standing. Some elements within the party began to favor entering into parliamentary politics back in Russia, a more moderate approach, despite the glaring fact that the State Duma, which Tsar Nicholas II had established in 1905, was little more than a smokescreen, a hollow pretense of parliamentary representation. Moreover, both his and Nadia's health were quietly declining during this period. Lenin was likely suffering from the early stages of acute atherosclerosis, a disease which leads to an abnormal buildup of fat and cholesterol on the artery walls, a silent internal struggle. Though some historians have hypothesized that his health problems may have stemmed from neurosyphilis, the exact cause of his ailment remains, in part, shrouded in the quiet mists of medical history. Whatever the precise origin, these health issues began to cause considerable problems during these years in exile, contributing to a sense of weariness, as his star waned within the Russian communist movement. Meanwhile, in 1912, the long-standing simmering split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks was formalized, a decisive and irreversible break. They divided into two entirely separate political parties, each charting its own distinct course. The opportunity for Lenin to re-establish himself as a central figure within the Bolshevik Party, and for the Russian communist movement to reignite itself, emerged in the strangest and most unexpected of fashions, specifically the outbreak of a monumental European war. For many years, tensions between the major European powers had been building, a quiet, dangerous pressure beneath the surface, over a myriad of complex issues. Most notably, there was the rise of the German Empire, a formidable challenge to British supremacy, creating a subtle shift in the balance of power. Colonial rivalry amongst all the major powers fueled a fierce scramble for territories in Africa, and a similar, if quieter, scramble for influence and resources in Asia. Regionally, tensions simmered and flared over the changing political situation in the Balkans, where the ancient Ottoman Empire was slowly, inexorably collapsing after centuries of dominating the region. Russia, with its historical ties and strategic interests, was particularly concerned with this latter issue, where it found itself in quiet, yet intense, competition with the Empire of Austria-Hungary to succeed the Turks as the dominant regional power. Thus, when a regional crisis arose there in the summer of 1914, involving a fateful assassination, it soon escalated, drawing in one nation after another. Within days it had mushroomed into a full-scale war between Russia and Austria-Hungary. Germany quickly joined Austria-Hungary, true to its alliances, and the British and the French, in turn, declared war on the governments in Berlin and Vienna in support of their Russian ally. The First World War, a conflict of unprecedented scale, had commenced, and by the time its terrible course was run, Russia would be utterly transformed, its old order swept away. When the war broke out in the final days of July 1914, Lenin was in Galicia, a region that today straddles the borders of Poland and Ukraine, but which in the early 20th century formed part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was briefly imprisoned by the Austro-Hungarian authorities, a quiet detainment owing to his Russian citizenship, which made him suspect in enemy territory. However, he was soon able to prove, with quiet conviction, that he was anything but a supporter of the Tsarist regime of Nicholas II, a fact that was well known to European intelligence. Thus, he was released, and he and Nadia, ever on the move, headed to neutral Switzerland, a peaceful haven amidst the gathering storm in Europe. There they spent the next 2 years, as the war raged around them, their lives in quiet contrast to the vast conflict. In Switzerland he continued his intellectual work, writing and theorizing, eventually publishing Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in 1917. By now, Lenin's political thought was beginning to mature and crystallize, and he was willing to diverge from orthodox Marxism in a way that few communist ideologues of the 1910s dared to. In particular, he rejected Marx's long-held idea that every society had to gradually transition from autocracy, in the shape of kings and emperors, to a bourgeois democracy governed by the middle and upper classes, before it could then transition to a socialist revolution, and ultimately, to communism. Lenin, always with a keen eye on the unique situation in Russia, where no true bourgeois democracy could yet be said to have emerged, theorized in the peaceful alpine region of Switzerland during the mid-1910s, that it was indeed possible for a state to move straight from autocracy to a socialist revolution. This revolutionary leap would effectively skip the lengthy and often painful development of a bourgeois democracy, bypassing what Marx had considered a necessary stage. Such a bold experiment, a quiet theoretical proposition, would soon be attempted in Russia itself. As Lenin's political thought was evolving in the tranquil quiet of Switzerland, Russia's war effort was proceeding dismally, a stark contrast to the calm of his intellectual endeavors. The Russian army was poorly commanded, badly trained, and on the Eastern Front, it faced the formidable German Imperial Army, widely considered the most effective military in the world. Matters were further compounded when Tsar Nicholas II, in a fateful and quiet decision, decided to take personal command of the army himself in 1916, a move that proved more symbolic than effective. Interestingly, 1916 did actually see some Russian gains, most notably through the Brusilov offensive, which resulted in the capture of extensive territory in Poland. Romania's entry into the war on the side of Britain, France, and Russia also offered some aid to the Russian war effort in the Balkans. However, by the end of the year, despite these limited successes, the internal situation within Russia was deteriorating rapidly. Food shortages and social unrest were escalating, reaching new heights of discontent. The grinding demands of the war effort crippled supply lines, causing scarcity everywhere, affecting the daily lives of millions. Disaffection with the Tsarist government was also running at an all-time high, owing in no small part to widespread concerns about the undue influence over the imperial family of Grigory Rasputin, a mystic and self-proclaimed holy man, whose presence cast a long, unsettling shadow. Eventually, this simmering discontent spilled over, quietly at first, then with gathering force, on the 23rd of February 1917. Mass protests erupted in St. Petersburg, a city that had been patriotically renamed Petrograd in 1914, and then spread to other Russian cities over the following week. The Tsarist government gradually, inexorably, lost control of the country. By early March, it was devastatingly clear that the military, the traditional bulwark of the regime, was no longer willing to intervene in a decisive way to save Nicholas II. With his family surrounded in Petrograd, and himself surrounded by hostile troops as he attempted to make his way back to the capital from the Eastern Front, the Tsar eventually took the solemn advice of the army chiefs and several senior members of the Duma. On the 3rd of March 1917, with a quiet, somber finality, he abdicated the throne. The brief February Revolution had, in a matter of days, brought the 300-year reign of the Romanov dynasty to a quiet, decisive end. In the peaceful confines of Switzerland, Lenin was soon abreast of the momentous events unfolding back home. Within days, he was preparing to return to Russia once again after many more years in exile, a journey he had long awaited. His power and influence within the Bolshevik movement had seen a quiet revival during the war, largely owing to his unwavering stance that the communist movement should refuse to play any role in the conflict. Instead, he had consistently lambasted it as a mere clash of capitalist and imperialist regimes, a struggle of no benefit to the working class. He was in a strange twist of fate, facilitated in his efforts to head back to Russia by the German government. In a calculated move, they provided a sealed train to him and a few dozen other Russian dissidents, allowing them to travel safely from the Swiss-German border to the North Sea. The German belief was that Lenin, once back in Russia, would serve to further destabilize Russia's politics, potentially aiding the German war effort on the Eastern Front by sowing further internal discord and pushing Russia out of the war. By March, the quiet company of revolutionaries had reached the Baltic Sea, where they boarded a ferry to neutral Sweden, and then continued onwards by land, journeying north through Sweden and into Finland. Along the way, they received quiet, urgent updates of developments in Petrograd, where the State Duma had formed a provisional government, one that looked set to be dominated by a mix of centrist revolutionaries and the liberal aristocracy. But this new regime had immediately run into trouble, facing immense pressure as the Russian lines on the Eastern Front literally collapsed in the face of mounting desertions and a profound lack of leadership. Thus, when Lenin's train pulled into Petrograd on the 16th of April 1917, the new regime was already experiencing significant difficulties, its hold fragile. He immediately and with quiet determination set to work bolstering the Bolshevik cause, addressing large rallies of proletarian workers in the city throughout the late spring and early summer. He also busily distributed the April Theses, a concise and radical document he had written on his journey back to Russia, which called for a new government based around workers' councils, known as Soviets. Tensions quietly built in the weeks that followed, culminating in mid-July, a period that became known as the July Days. During this time, workers and soldiers engaged in violent demonstrations against the provisional government, their anger fueled by Bolshevik agitation. In the aftermath of the July Days, the provisional government moved swiftly to suppress the Bolsheviks, perceiving them as a serious threat. Lenin and many of his followers were forced to flee once more, slipping quietly over the border to the semi-autonomous Grand Duchy of Finland, seeking refuge. Other senior members of the party, such as Leon Trotsky, an emerging theorist and organizer, were arrested in Petrograd. From Helsinki in the early autumn of 1917, Lenin and his followers began plotting a new counter-revolution in Russia, a quiet but determined plan to overthrow the provisional government. They were not alone in their disillusionment. Elements within the Russian army and navy were plotting similar initiatives against the provisional government, which was by then effectively living on borrowed time. Its poor handling of the war and its failure to stabilize the domestic situation had eroded its legitimacy. Throughout the autumn, the political situation remained tense and fluid in Russia, a quiet storm brewing. The commander-in-chief of the Russian military, General Lava Kornilov, even attempted a military takeover in August, aiming to suppress what he saw as anarchy. In order to suppress this challenge, the provisional government was forced, in a desperate move, to turn to the communists and their workers' Soviets in Petrograd for help, a development that significantly strengthened the cause of the Bolsheviks, giving them renewed legitimacy and influence. Lenin, sensing the opportune moment, was consequently able to slip quietly back across the border into the capital in early October, where Leon Trotsky had by then been elected as head of the influential Petrograd Soviet. The Bolsheviks had also by this time managed to quietly outflank their rivals within the Russian communist movement, the Mensheviks. The latter had played a greater role in the State Duma over the years, and had cooperated more openly with the provisional government since March, a strategy that now seemed to betray their revolutionary ideals in the eyes of many. In contrast, the Bolsheviks were increasingly able to capitalize on their persistently uncompromising attitude, a stance they had maintained since the 1900s. Thus, by the time Lenin returned to Petrograd in October, the time was wholly propitious, the conditions perfectly aligned, for the Bolsheviks to make their decisive move, to try to seize power in Russia once and for all. The coup, which occurred in Petrograd on the 7th of November 1917, or the 25th of October in the Julian calendar, which Russia still used at the time, was one of the seminal moments in modern world history, a quiet turning point that would echo for decades. Lauded thereafter by the communist movement as the October Revolution, it followed several weeks of careful planning by Lenin, Trotsky, and others in Petrograd during early and mid-October. Armed militias, known as Red Guards, were quietly prepared in Petrograd, Moscow, and other key cities, ready to move against the government. It is a sign of how powerful and well-organized the movement had become that the provisional government was aware of what was being planned, yet, despite their knowledge and efforts, they could not stop it. Despite efforts to effectively shut down the city of Petrograd on the 24th of October to forestall a further revolution, Lenin and Trotsky responded swiftly, calling on the Military Revolutionary Committee and the Soviets to occupy key government buildings on the 25th of October. By the end of that day, most of Petrograd and Moscow were quietly yet firmly under Bolshevik control. The following day, Bolshevik Red Guards, their revolutionary soldiers, entered the Winter Palace in Petrograd, the very symbol of imperial power, and effectively removed the provisional government from power. That evening, a Congress of Russia's workers' councils, the Soviets, was convened in Petrograd, a quiet gathering of immense significance. This culminated the following day, the 27th of October, in the solemn declaration of a new socialist government. In order not to alienate the bulk of the Russian population, most of whom were still agrarian agricultural workers, talk of a communist state was initially limited, a strategic quietness. But that is in essence what was effectively established in late October 1917. Within days, the revolutionaries, now firmly in control, made some of their core views and intentions known to the wider political community across Russia. This was a polyglot empire, a vast and diverse land which stretched from the Baltic Sea in Europe to the Pacific Ocean, and from the Arctic Circle south into the deserts of Central Asia. It incorporated a vast array of different peoples, including Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Georgians, Finns, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Moldavans, Kazakhs, Turkmen, Armenians, and the various ethnic peoples of the thinly populated Siberian region beyond the Ural Mountains. It was with the quiet, earnest goal of assuring this vast array of people that the new government would rule Russia for all its people, respecting their diverse identities, that the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia was issued on the 2nd of November 1917, just days after the Bolsheviks had seized power in Petrograd. This declaration affirmed that all ethnic people living under Russian rule were equal and sovereign, and fundamentally had a right to self-determination, a truly revolutionary concept for the time. It also abolished religious and national privileges, aligning with the core tenets of Marxist ideology. The document, which was quietly signed by Lenin and Joseph Stalin, who had by then risen to become a senior figure within the Bolshevik movement since his first emergence during the revolution. In the months that followed, real power was increasingly vested in the hands of the workers' councils, or Soviets, in key cities like Petrograd and Moscow, giving them a visible, if localized, authority. Meanwhile, centralized power was quietly monopolized by the Political Bureau, or Politburo, of the Russian Communist Party, a smaller, more concentrated body. In tandem, the party began a concentrated, methodical campaign of expelling Mensheviks and members of other socialist and revolutionary groups from the Soviets and other political bodies. This was a quiet but deliberate consolidation of power. Thus, by the end of 1918, the Russian Communist Party had effectively transformed Russia into a one-party state, which they controlled completely, quietly dismantling any semblance of shared power. Lenin, in the course of this formative year 1918, emerged as the undisputed head of the new communist state. Perhaps most importantly, he was the chair of Sovnarkom, the name of the Council of People's Commissars, which effectively oversaw the governance of the Soviets, or workers' councils throughout Russia, on behalf of the Russian Communist Party. This body would subsequently become one of the main executive branches of the government of what was evolving into the Soviet Union. The chairs of Sovnarkom would later serve as the official head of state, but these titles and roles were still evolving and finding their footing in 1918, a period of quiet organizational growth. As well as chairing Sovnarkom, Lenin also sat on the Politburo and the Council of Labor and Defense, holding multiple key positions. Thus, when Lenin relocated to the Kremlin in Moscow, the ancient center of government prior to the moving of the capital to St. Petersburg by Tsar Peter I, in the early 18th century, he did so as the most powerful figure within the new communist regime, quietly taking the reins of a vast, complex state. This ascent, however, came at a significant cost, for the political environment remained highly unstable, fraught with danger. There were 3 serious attempts on his life alone in 1918, a stark reminder of the perils of leadership in a revolutionary time. The third assassination attempt, occurring on the morning of the 30th of August 1918, was particularly severe. It resulted in Lenin being shot twice and badly wounded, with blood entering his lungs. His health, which had been precarious for years, rapidly declined in the period thereafter, a quiet but profound deterioration. In tandem with this reorganization of the government in 1918, establishing a country ruled by the Politburo Sovnarkom and the Soviets, the Communist Party began to introduce a number of major economic reforms, all in line with Marxist ideology. This declared that all the land across Russia, which was owned by the old Russian nobility and the Orthodox Church, was now confiscated by the state, and was to be presently redistributed amongst the peasantry in line with communist ideology, a quiet reordering of ancient landholdings. A debate would follow, involving Lenin and others, over what kind of agricultural policies should be followed thereafter. Lenin quietly favored the establishment of large collective farms, run by the state, aiming for efficiency and shared ownership. But this significant agricultural policy would not be fully resolved for some time. In the cities, major industries and factories were also brought under state ownership, and the new ownership structure effectively handed control of them over to the Soviets, empowering the workers. New rules were introduced to reform the labor laws as well, marking a quiet but impactful change in the lives of ordinary people. For instance, the working day was limited to 8 hours a day, a highly liberal and progressive decision for its time, especially given that workers across Europe, in many countries like Britain and Germany, had been agitating for decades to have the working day gradually reduced from as much as 14 or 12 hours a day. In tandem with these economic and property reforms, a wide array of legislation was quietly passed by Lenin's government in late 1917 and 1918, designed to fundamentally transform the social and legal landscape of Russia. For instance, communist ideology inherently rejected religion as an opiate of the masses. Accordingly, in January 1918, the new government decreed the immediate separation of church and state, a monumental shift in a country where the Orthodox Church had wielded immense power for centuries. This occurred at a time when organized Christian churches across Europe still had a major influence over education and other social matters. In tandem, the new communist state quietly stepped into the breach and began providing free education to all. In a country like Russia, where only a very small proportion of the population had received a comprehensive education in the early 20th century, this was a major transformative development. A dedicated campaign to begin tackling widespread illiteracy was also initiated, aiming to bring knowledge and enlightenment to every corner of the vast land. Other vital aspects of Russian life, such as banking, transport, trade, and communications, were also soon being brought under state ownership and control, creating a centralized system. Meanwhile, the old Tsarist legal system, with its ancient traditions and aristocratic biases, was quickly replaced by one presided over by people's courts, a quiet but profound redefinition of justice. This new legal system differed significantly from most judicial systems across Europe, and from the common law courts of Britain in particular. The people's courts were presided over by a mix of a professional judge and two people's assessors. These assessors were akin to jurors in the common law system, but wielded greater powers, which included the right of decision in cases, in cooperation, of course, with the judge. This aimed to bring a more popular, less elite element into the administration of justice. Of course, beyond these sweeping economic and social reforms, there was still a colossal, devastating war to be dealt with. 1917 had been a terrible year for the Russian war effort on the Eastern Front, a period of immense suffering and loss. In the course of it, mass desertion from the ranks, and the widespread unwillingness of many Russian military commanders to fight, first for the Tsarist regime and then for the provisional government following the February Revolution, had seen the German Empire advance along a wide front, stretching from the Baltic Sea southeast through Poland and Ukraine, taking vast swathes of territory. Lenin's government quickly accepted the stark reality that it could not hope to extricate Russia from the brutal conflict without the significant loss of territory. And so, with a quiet but firm resolve, it entered into negotiations almost immediately with Berlin, with a view to terminating Russian involvement in what Lenin had always lambasted as a capitalist imperialist conflict, a war of no true benefit to the people. Accordingly, on the 3rd of March 1918, just 4 short months after the October Revolution, Russia and the Central Powers, led by Germany, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Under the terms of this harsh agreement, Russia effectively renounced control over all its territories in the Baltic States region, Poland and Ukraine, quietly ceding immense lands. Germany annexed much of the Russian territory in Poland, while the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were made into independent German vassal states. A new Ukrainian state acquired its independence, as did Finland further to the southeast. Russia also ceded some territory to Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire. This was an incredibly punitive peace agreement, one which stripped Russia of a vast amount of its prime agricultural land and important industrial cities, as well as some of the most densely populated areas of the former Russian Empire. But in agreeing to it, the nascent communist state, with a quiet sigh of relief, extricated itself from the devastating war with Germany. This difficult decision was made so that it could concentrate all its energies on consolidating its tenuous control over Russia itself, a far more immediate and pressing concern. Lenin's government desperately needed peace with Germany and the other Central Powers in the spring of 1918. For the revolution which they had initiated in October 1917 had not been accepted by a great many elements within Russia. Civil war, a terrible internal conflict, was rapidly developing across the nation, threatening to tear it apart. The primary enemy of the new regime were broadly known as the White Army, in contrast to the Red Army of the Soviet regime. But in reality, the Whites were a very broad and fractious array of counter-revolutionaries, united only by their unwillingness to accept the new regime. They included large segments of the old Russian aristocracy and the Orthodox Church, both of which had overnight found themselves stripped of the great wealth and immense power which they had enjoyed in Russia for centuries. Other elements amongst the Whites included fractious elements within the Russian army and navy, who were unwilling to accept the communist takeover, as well as other centrists and even leftists who gravitated towards the counter-revolution. once it became clear that the Bolsheviks were going to monopolize power and that there would be no form of democratic communism in Lenin's Russia. By the spring and summer of 1918, significant parts of Russia had tragically fallen into the hands of this unorthodox alliance of anti-Bolshevik forces. The early stages of the Russian Civil War were incredibly difficult for Lenin's government, a period of existential struggle. This was compounded by significant events elsewhere in the world. By the late autumn of 1918, the First World War was winding down, its colossal energies finally spent, as Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire began to collapse internally. The wider global conflict eventually came to a quiet, definitive end on the 11th of November 1918, when Germany surrendered, its Kaiser Wilhelm II already having abdicated his throne by that time. With the wider global conflict over, the victorious Allied powers, particularly Britain, but also France, the United States, and Japan, quietly determined to ensure the overthrow of the new communist state in Russia. The great powers in London and Paris were deeply concerned that a radical socialist government would come to control one of the most powerful states in Europe, seeing it as a dangerous precedent. And so from late 1918, Britain and others began supplying enormous resources to the White Army, pouring aid into the counter-revolutionary effort. Expeditionary forces were also dispatched to Russia by Britain and others, a quiet foreign intervention. Meanwhile, the newly created state of Poland, which was formed following Germany's defeat, went to war with Russia, receiving substantial Western aid. As all of this occurred, the early stages of the Civil War in 1918 and 19 were incredibly difficult for Lenin's government, a time when it seemed for some time that the new regime might not survive long, its very existence hanging by a thread. The immense emergency which confronted the fledgling Soviet state in 1918 and 1919 must be borne in mind when assessing the early development of that same state. Faced with multiple converging threats to its very existence, Lenin and his closest associates, such as Trotsky and Stalin, began unleashing a policy of state terror to retain control of the territory which remained in Soviet hands. This grim strategy was already occurring as early as December 1917, when Lenin quietly ordered the creation of the Emergency Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. It is better known by its terrifying acronym, the Cheka, and it was the first of the extremely powerful secret police services established by the Soviet state over its 74-year history. The Cheka was tasked with rooting out anyone deemed to be a counter-revolutionary or enemy of the state, a broad and chilling mandate. Its leader, Felix Dzerzhinsky, was given wide-ranging powers to undertake this mission. Within weeks, hundreds, and then thousands, of perceived enemies of the state were being arrested and executed without trial, their lives quietly extinguished. A great many others were detained and sent to newly established labor camps, forming the genesis of the Gulag system in the remote, inhospitable climes of Siberia, a return to Tsarist methods of political exile, but on a far more terrifying scale. Lenin attempted to distance himself from what became known as the Red Terror, but there is no denying that he was the undisputed head of the Soviet state during a time when the worst elements of the Tsarist regime were revived, and indeed amplified, in order to create the architecture of a security state, which would broadly define Soviet Russia for the next 7 decades. The Red Terror was but one element in the brutal policies adopted by the nascent Soviet state in order to fight the Civil War and secure the regime's survival. Another was the controversial use of blocking units in the war effort. The idea for these had come from Leon Trotsky, and essentially involved using units of Red Army soldiers, who stood behind the Soviet front lines, and gunned down any Soviet soldiers who attempted to retreat, a desperate and chilling measure to prevent desertion and maintain discipline. Brutal as these methods were, they soon proved effective in stemming the tide of the Civil War. The war effort reached a low ebb in the summer and autumn of 1918, as a British and French expeditionary force landed at Arkhangelsk on the White Sea, even before the wider war against Germany had been concluded. A legion of Czech and Slovak soldiers, former prisoners of war which had penetrated deep into Russia, seized the important city of Kazan and Vladivostok. The main port in the east was attacked by the Japanese thereafter, adding to the multi-front conflict. However, Trotsky, with his quiet but effective organizational genius, mobilized the Red Army in a remarkably effective manner. Kazan was retaken in September 1918, a quiet victory, and Samara followed in October. Yet, these efforts were somewhat offset when newly independent Poland, sensing weakness, declared war in November, opening yet another front. Still, the initial onslaught of 1918 by the Western powers and their proxies had failed to crush the communist state, and the end of the First World War brought new distractions for the Entente powers, as wars and conflicts broke out in Ireland, Turkey, and other regions in 1919, drawing their attention elsewhere. In 1919, the Red Army went on the offensive, pushing forward with quiet determination. In early February, Kiev fell as the Communists began reasserting their control over Ukraine, a territory they had lost with the punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. By April, the British, French, and American troops in Ukraine were forced to pull out of the region as the port of Odessa fell to the Russians, and communist control of Ukraine was firmly established. In August, the British and French expeditionary forces around Arkhangelsk and Murmansk in the north, by the White Sea, were evacuated, marking the end of significant direct Western intervention. Thereafter, the Western powers were largely reduced to fighting the Soviets indirectly, through their proxies in the White Army, Poland, and some of Russia's other neighbors, though a token American and Japanese presence was maintained in the far east of the country. Meanwhile, the war in the West now concentrated largely on Russia's clash with Poland. At first, the Poles made major advances, seizing Kiev early in 1920, a quiet but significant setback for the Red Army. But after a powerful Soviet counteroffensive threatened Warsaw itself, an armistice was finally agreed in the autumn, bringing a measure of peace to that front. Thus, by the end of 1920, the Russian Civil War had largely been won by Lenin's regime, a quiet but definitive triumph for the Bolsheviks, though mopping up operations continued in many isolated locations until the recapture of the port of Vladivostok in October 1922, finally brought the war to a complete, quiet end across the vast Russian lands. Lenin, during the long years of the Civil War, had largely left the operational leadership of the Red Army to others, most notably the brilliant strategist Trotsky. Instead, he had spent the late 1910s quietly formulating a new approach to international socialism and communism. This intellectual endeavor was in response to calls by the British Labour Party in 1918 for a new international conference of socialist parties to be called a Labour and Socialist International. But the Russian leader had become deeply disillusioned with the more moderate socialist movements which prevailed in Western Europe during his years in exile, seeing them as insufficiently revolutionary. He was instead committed to establishing a new international socialist movement, one which would be unapologetically led by Soviet Russia, asserting its revolutionary vanguard role. Accordingly, in March 1919, the first Congress of the Communist International was held in Moscow, better known by its abbreviated name, the Comintern. There was much optimism at this gathering about the possibility of a world revolution of socialism, given that communist revolutions had in fact briefly occurred in Germany and Hungary in the weeks preceding the first Comintern, sparking hopes that the global capitalist order was crumbling. But these revolutionary movements were soon suppressed, and in his later years, Lenin must have been quietly aware that no immediate widespread overthrow of the international capitalist system would occur. Nevertheless, The establishment of the Comintern was extremely significant, as in years to come it would serve as a major instrument of international communism, firmly led and directed by the Soviet Union. One final intriguing policy of the Soviet regime under Lenin warrants our quiet attention. In the spring of 1921, as the Civil War was finally winding down and the immense task of rebuilding lay ahead, the Soviet leader promulgated what he called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This represented something of a change of course, a quiet but significant departure from his previous staunch ideological Marxist positions. It may have surprised many then, when he outlined plans for a new economic system which would allow the capitalist free market to continue operating, albeit on a limited basis, in Russia for the foreseeable future. It was declared that Russians could also now own small amounts of land and businesses, marking a partial return to private enterprise, though major industry and large agricultural estates naturally remained under state ownership, preserving the core socialist principles. The primary purpose of the new economic policy was pragmatic, to stabilize the Russian economy in the immediate aftermath of the devastating war, and to introduce some much-needed growth into the system. This was a critical period, coming at a time when the worst famine since that of 1891 and 1892 had spread across the country, further compounding the immense suffering. Ultimately, the new economic policy resulted in a major boost to the Russian economy as it exited the war, demonstrating, in a quiet but powerful way, the benefits of at least allowing a limited amount of private ownership and free trade to continue. Yet, the new economic policy would be gradually and quietly abandoned in the course of the 1920s as the process of full state management of industry and farm collectivization intensified, pushing Russia back towards a more centrally controlled economic model. The about-face in the early 1920s, the adoption of the new economic policy, of course, raises quiet questions as to how we should perceive Lenin's political thought overall. After all, this was something of a new departure from classical Marxism, a pragmatic concession. But then Lenin had been willing to depart from the 19th century German political theorists' writings for some time, adapting theory to the harsh realities of Russia. To the extent that Leninism became its own distinct brand of communist thought by the 1920s, one which continued to influence communist regimes globally throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Essentially, Leninism's core idea was that a socialist revolution need not necessarily be preceded by the slow, organic development of a bourgeois democracy and a fully fledged capitalist system, which would in turn create a large urban proletariat deemed necessary to implement the socialist revolution, and then create a communist state in due course. Instead, Lenin espoused the powerful idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, no matter how small or nascent that proletariat might be in a given state. This vanguard party of the proletariat, a disciplined and dedicated group, would then lead the rest of society, guiding it towards socialism and ultimately communism. This was an important, perhaps even revolutionary development in Marxist thought. Marx himself would likely have scoffed at the idea of communism developing in countries like China, Mongolia, or Angola, where there was little industrialization, let alone a large urban proletariat ready to seize the means of production. But Leninism, with its adaptable message of a small, determined vanguard of the proletariat, leading any nation to communism, regardless of its level of industrial development, would have a profound and lasting impact on the entire 20th century, quietly shaping the destiny of vast populations. Lenin, however, would not live to see the full global reach of these ideas. His health had been steadily declining throughout the 1910s, a quiet internal struggle, though the exact cause of his ailment has never been definitively established, remaining a subject of quiet medical debate. It deteriorated sharply, following the multiple assassination attempts in 1918, particularly when he was shot twice and badly wounded that autumn, an event that undoubtedly hastened his decline. Thereafter, his physicians, of which there were dozens called in during the late 1910s and early 1920s, to try to resolve his complex problems, concluded that he might be suffering from blood poisoning, brought on by the fact that the bullets from this most serious assassination attempt had never been successfully removed from his body. Eventually, in April 1922, he underwent an operation to have them surgically removed, a delicate procedure. But tragically, it did not bring about any improvement. Instead, throughout the early 1920s, he was increasingly restricted to Moscow, his world quietly shrinking as he suffered from an unusual combination of debilitating symptoms. These included persistent insomnia, a heightened sensitivity to sound and other stimuli, severe headaches, recurring nausea, and a pervasive general fatigue, symptoms that point to profound neurological distress. All of this eventually culminated in the summer of 1922, in the first of several strokes, which he suffered in the space of just a few months. These left him partially paralyzed and increasingly restricted to a wheelchair, his once vigorous body now greatly diminished, his mind still keen but his physical capabilities fading. As Lenin's health declined precipitously in the early 1920s, thoughts inevitably turned to the question of succession, a quiet but urgent concern within the nascent Soviet leadership. What arrangement might be put in place if he died or was rendered completely unable to lead the new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, as it had been newly christened in 1922, marking a formal consolidation of the diverse revolutionary states. Lenin had never truly established himself as a dictator in an absolute sense, his power more rooted in intellectual authority, and his long years at the forefront of the movement. Yet he had undeniably become the preeminent figure within the Soviet state, based on his many years at its forefront in exile, and his intellectual leadership, a quiet authority that permeated the party. Therefore, it was conceivable that nobody would succeed him in a singular capacity, but rather that the Politburo, the collective leadership body, would rule the Soviet Union collectively. Yet even Lenin himself harbored quiet doubts that such an arrangement could truly work, believing that a preeminent figure would inevitably emerge to succeed him. To that end, in the midst of his illness, in the winter of 1922, he dictated what became known as his last testament, a series of quiet reflections on the future of the party and its leaders. Here he discussed the respective qualities, both strengths and weaknesses, of the viable candidates for leadership. Foremost amongst them was Joseph Stalin, who had by then risen to become the General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position of immense organizational power, quietly consolidating influence behind the scenes. But Lenin had by then become wary of the Georgian, whom he had first met 17 years earlier, at the time of the revolution of 1905. In his testament, Lenin expressed concerns, claiming Stalin was overly ambitious, and from an intellectual standpoint, poorly equipped for supreme leadership, a quiet but damning assessment. Instead, Lenin, in this final crucial document, gave his quiet approval for Leon Trotsky to succeed him, recognizing his intellectual brilliance and revolutionary zeal. The dictation of this testament was one of his last lucid major acts, a final quiet attempt to guide the destiny of the revolution he had so painstakingly built. In March 1923, Lenin suffered yet another stroke, a devastating blow, as a result of which he tragically lost the ability to speak, his voice, once so powerful, now silenced. Thereafter he continued to decline, his body gradually succumbing to his ailments, before falling into a coma in the first weeks of 1924. He died quietly on the 21st of January, 1924, bringing to a close a life that had irrevocably altered the course of history. The political machinations to succeed Lenin began immediately, a quiet but intense struggle for power within the party. Trotsky, tragically, was convalescing from an illness in the warmer weather of the Caucasus region when Lenin died. In a calculated move, Stalin sent him incorrect details of the funeral arrangements, subtly ensuring that he missed the state funeral, which was held in Moscow on the 27th of January, a significant absence that would hurt Trotsky's standing. Lenin's body was subsequently embalmed, and in a remarkable and enduring act of reverence, or perhaps political theater, placed on public display in a mausoleum in Red Square in central Moscow, where it is still viewable a century later, a quiet, eternal symbol. Despite Lenin's quiet warnings in his testament, many of the other senior members of the Soviet regime and the Politburo favored Stalin in the aftermath of Lenin's death. Stalin, a master of quiet manipulation, quickly entered a political alliance with two of the senior members of the Politburo, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, an alliance which he skillfully used to systematically undermine Trotsky in the years that followed. He eventually drove Trotsky into exile, and then, with ruthless efficiency, turned on his former allies. By 1929, Stalin had monopolized power completely in his own hands, and established himself as a dictator in a manner which Lenin in his lifetime never had. For the next quarter of a century, Stalin ruled the Soviet Union in a totalitarian fashion, murdering millions in his relentless quest to retain absolute power, a terrifying legacy. The man who was born as Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov and became known to the world as Lenin, the pen name he quietly adopted in the early 1900s, was undoubtedly one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. He hailed from an upper-middle-class bourgeois background, a comfortable beginning, and then, in a profound turn, reacted violently against that same background from a very young age. This pivotal development was brought about in part by the tragic execution of his older brother by the authoritarian Tsarist regime in the late 1880s, a quiet trauma that set him on a new path. Over the next quarter of a century, he emerged as the leading intellectual figure within the Bolshevik movement, quietly theorizing about how communism could function in Russia, and in the process, moving beyond the more rigid confines of traditional Marxist thought. As a result, when the First World War created a propitious, if chaotic, environment for a communist state to emerge in Russia in 1917, he became its undisputed leader. His message was clear and compelling. The Russian proletariat and the communists, as small in number as they might be compared to the vast population of the Russian Empire as a whole, would act as a vanguard, a guiding force for the development of communism in Russia, and then, he hoped, the world. The Russian Revolution was born of a profound idealism and the earnest goal of overthrowing the autocratic imperial regime which had ruled Russia for centuries, a yearning for a new world. But nation-states, like individuals, can rarely escape their past entirely, and that proved to be all too true of Soviet Russia. Within weeks of the Bolsheviks seizing power, they had begun to create a communist state which in many ways quietly mirrored the Tsarist regime which preceded it. The Cheka was created as a secret police, effectively succeeding the Okhrana, the secret police under the Tassars, but with even greater, more chilling powers. Political dissidents were soon being sent off to labor camps and into exile in Siberia, much as they had been in imperial times, though now on an even larger, more systematic scale, and the possibility of a democratic legislative assembly being established within a new communist state was quickly dashed, as a dictatorship of the Soviets and the Politburo was quietly created, with Lenin at its summit, consolidating power in a way that left little room for dissent.